The Spiderweb by Joseph Roth. Translated and read by Leon Stevens. 1. Theodor grew up in the house of his father, the rail customs auditor and former sergeant major Wilhelm Lohse. Little Theodor was a blond, industrious, and well-behaved boy. He yearningly hoped for the importance he later achieved, though he never dared believe in it. We might say he exceeded the expectations he had never proposed for himself. Old Lohse experienced nothing further of his son's accomplishment. It had only been granted the customs auditor to see Theodor in the uniform of a reserve lieutenant. The old man had never wished for more. He died in the 4th year of the Great War, and the final moment of his life was exalted by the thought that Lieutenant Theodor Lohse would walk behind his casket. A year later, Theodor was no longer a lieutenant, but a law student and tutor in the jeweler Ephrussy's house. At the jeweler's, every day he received coffee with cream and lemon peel, and a ham roll, and every month a fee. These were the basis of his material existence. For at technical emergency assistance, where he was counted a member, work was rare, and that rarity was hard and poorly paid. From the Reserve Officers' Economic Union he received legumes once a week. He shared these with his mother and sisters, whose house he lived in, tolerated, not esteemed, little heeded, and when in spite of everything it occurred, regarded with disparagement. His mother was ailing, his sisters were turning yellow. They were getting old and could not forgive Theodor that he had not fulfilled, as a lieutenant twice named a hero in military dispatches, his duty to be killed. A dead son would ever have remained the pride of the family. A discharged lieutenant and sacrificial victim of the Revolution was a nuisance to the women. Theodor spent life with his relatives like an old grandfather, who would have been honored had he but died, who was disparaged because he clung to life. He could have been spared a great deal of hardship had wordless enmity not stood like a wall between him and his household. He could have said to his sisters that he did not blame them for his misfortune, that he abhorred the revolution, that he cultivated hatred for socialists and Jews, that he bore each day of his life like a painful yoke on his bowed neck, and imagined himself entrapped in his time as in a sunless dungeon. From without no release beckoned, and flight was impossible. But he said nothing. He had always been reticent. He had always sensed the invisible hand over his lips. Always, even as a child. He could only speak what he had learned by heart, whose tones lay complete and soundlessly formed a dozen times in his ears, in his throat. He had to study a long time before the obdurate words turned supple and fitted into his brain. He learned stories by heart as well as poems. The image of the printed sentences stood before his eyes as if he saw them in the book, the page number above, and at the edge the nose, scrawled in idle quarter hours. Every hour had a strange face. Everything overwhelmed him. Every happening was dreadful, if only because it was new, and had vanished before he could impress it on his mind. From timorousness he learned care, became diligent, prepared himself with obstinate restlessness, and discovered again and again that preparation still gave inadequate results. But he multiplied his efforts tenfold and made his way up to 2nd place in school. Top of the class was the Jew Glauser, who, cheerful and smiling, untroubled by books and cares, prowled through the breaks, who would draft a faultless Latin sentence in 20 minutes, and in whose head vocabulary, grammatical formulas, exceptions, and irregular verbs seemed to sprout without need of laborious cultivation. The Ephrusy boy was so similar to Glauser that Theodor had difficulty maintaining authority in the face of the jeweler's son. Theodor had to suppress a gentle, obstinate, welling timidity before he could correct his pupil. For the young Ephrusy would dash off a mistake so confidently, he pronounced it so self-assuredly, that Theodor was inclined to doubt the textbook and give credence to his pupil's error. And it had always been so. Theodor had always believed in the other's power, any other who confronted him. Only in the army was he happy. He had necessarily to believe what he was told, and the others likewise when it was he who spoke. Theodor would readily have remained in the army all his life. Civilian life was different, cruel, full of malice in unfamiliar corners. If you took pains, they went nowhere. If you squandered your strength on uncertain prospects, it meant endlessly constructing a house of cards blown down by a mysterious gust of wind. No effort served, no diligence came by its reward. There was no superior whose moods you could ascertain, whose wishes you could anticipate. They were all superiors, everyone in the street, his fellow students in the lecture hall, even his mother and his sisters as well. They all had it easy. Above all, the Glazers and the Efrusis, one top of the class, and this one a jeweler, and that one the rich jeweler's son. Only in the army they had come to nothing, rarely sergeants. Their justice prevailed over fraud, because it was all fraud. Glazers dishonestly acquired knowledge like the jeweler's money. There was something funny going on if Grünbaum the soldier got leave and if Efrusi was pulling off a deal. The revolution was defrauded, the Kaiser betrayed, the general duped, the Republic a Jewish setup. Theodor saw all that himself, and others' opinions reinforced his impressions. Clever heads like Wilhelm Tiedemann, Professor Goethe, Bastelmann the lecturer, Lorentz the physicist, Mannheim the race researcher, asserted and demonstrated the perniciousness of the Jewish race on lecture evenings at the Alliance of German Law Students and in their books, which were on display in the reading room of the Germania. The elder Lohse had often warned his daughters against getting involved with young Jews in dance classes. He gave examples. It happened to him, Lohse, the rail customs auditor, at least twice a month, that Jews from Posen, who are the worst, tried to bribe him. In the war they were exempted, classified unfit for front-line duty. They had desk jobs as scribes in sick bays and behind-the-line command posts. In the juridical seminar, they always volunteered to speak and created unfamiliar situations in which Theodor felt vulnerable and pushed into additional disagreeable, hurried, trying tasks. Now they had devastated the army. Now they dominated the state. They fabricated socialism, renunciation of the fatherland, love for the enemy. It was stated in the Elders of Zion, all members of the Reserve Officers' Union who partook of the Friday legumes received the book, that they strove for world domination. They had the police under control and persecuted nationalist organizations. And you had to teach their sons, live dependent on them, live badly. How did they live? Oh, how magnificently they lived! The Efrusi house was separated from the vulgar street by a gray, silver-gleaming grill and surrounded by broad green lawns. The gravel gleamed white, brighter yet the steps that led to the door. Paintings in gold frames hung in the vestibule, and a servant in green and golden livery received and bowed. The jeweler was tall and thin, always dressed in black, in a long black vest from whose neck only a slightly blacker collar band peeked out, adorned with a pearl the size of a hazelnut. Theodor's family occupied 3 rooms in Moabit, and the finest contained 2 wobbly cupboards, the sideboard as the centerpiece, and as its only jewel that silver ornament which Theodor had rescued from the castle at Amiens and hidden at the bottom of the trunk a mere moment before the arrival of strict Major Krause, who did not permit such things to happen. No, Theodor did not live in a villa behind silver-lustrous filigree grills, and no position consoled him for the neediness of his life. He was a tutor with failed hopes, repressed courage, but perpetually pulsing, tormenting ambition. Women with a sweet, loose music in their swaying hips passed him by, unattainable, and yet he was created to enjoy them. As a lieutenant he would have possessed them, all of them, including young Mrs. Efrusi, the jeweler's second spouse. How far away she was! She came from that great world in which Theodor should nearly have arrived by now. She was a lady. Jewish, but a lady. In a lieutenant's uniform he would necessarily have attracted her, not in the civilian garb of a tutor. He once had, in his time as a lieutenant on leave in Berlin, an adventure with a lady. He could really say lady, wife of a cigar merchant who was gone to Flanders. His photograph hung in the dining room. She wore violet underpants. They were the first violet underpants in Theodor's manly existence. What ladies he aspired to now! His were the little mademoiselles at a cheap price, the hasty minute of cold love in the nocturnal darkness of a stairwell, in the recess, agitated by the fear of a chance neighbor returning home, desire extinguished in the dread of an unexpected step, as embers go cold flung glowing into a liquid. His was the simple barefoot lass from the north, the girl with square, hard-skinned hands whose caresses were rough, whose movements cooled, whose linen was dirty, whose stockings were soaked in sweat. She was not from his world, Mrs. Ephrussi. While he listened to her voice, it occurred to him that she must be good. No one had ever said so many beautiful things to him so simply and heartfelt. "You understand it wonderfully, Mr. Lohse? Do you like it here? Do you feel all right with us?" Oh, how good, beautiful, young she was! Theodor could have wished for a sister like her. One day he was startled to meet her outside a shop. As if it had suddenly become plain to him, he remembered at that instant that he had been thinking of her all along his way. He was shocked to discover that she lived in him, that against his will and without realizing it he had stopped short, that he accepted her invitation to get into the car and would almost have done so before her. At times he would be thrown against her. He brushed her arm and quickly begged her pardon. He did not hear her questions. He had to pay strained attention so as not to bump into her again. Nevertheless, it happened. He prepared himself avidly for the moment of getting out, but the car halted sooner than he expected, and now there was no longer time to get out, to ask helpfully for her hand. He stayed sitting and made her wait until he should step down. The chauffeur was already holding precisely the package that he wanted to grasp. From a very great distance her words of farewell struck his ear, but her smile lived undeniably near before his eyes, as if it were the mirror-image smile of a lady speaking from far away. He never reached her. What, did he want to? His desire was ardent, but belief in his ability to conquer faded since he was no longer a lieutenant. He should first have to become one again. He wanted to become one, become a lieutenant or something else. Not to remain in obscurity, and no more to be hidden, not an unassuming brick in the structure of a wall, not the last among his comrades, not the listener and laugher when they told anecdotes and cracked jokes, no longer alone in the crowd, alone with his futile yearning to be heard, and with the perpetual disappointment of one ignored, patient and beloved on account of his thoughtful attentiveness. Oh, did they believe he was harmless and innocuous? They'd soon see. They'd all soon see. He will soon step out of his inglorious corner, a victor, no longer imprisoned in time, no longer weighed down by the yoke of his days. Brilliant fanfares were blaring somewhere on the horizon. 2. Sometimes his own pride assaulted him like a strange power, and he feared his desires, which held him captive. But whenever he walked through the streets, he heard a million strange voices, a million brilliant colors shimmered before his eyes, the treasures of the world ringing and flashing. Music wafted out of open windows, sweet scents of striding women, the pride and power of self-assured men. Whenever he walked through the Brandenburg Gate, he dreamed the old lost dream of victorious entry on a snow-white steed, as the mounted captain at the head of his company, gazed upon by 1,000 women, perhaps kissed by many, flags fluttering and acclaim thundering all around. He had borne this dream within and lovingly nourished it from the first moment of his voluntary entry into the barracks, through the privations and vital struggles of the war. This dream had soothed the painful abuse of the drill instructor in the exercise yard, the hunger on a day-long march, the burning ache in the knees, detention in dark cells, the numbing, tormenting white of snowy nights on the watch-post, biting frost in the toes. The dream pushed to break out like a sickness which lives long invisible in joints, nerves, muscles, and swells all the body's blood vessels, one from which a man cannot escape, so it follows he escapes from himself. And in consequence of that unknown power which had often helped Theodor before, and which taught him that for the fulfillment of every agonizing aspiration a favorable outward circumstance will come at the last minute to meet one halfway, it happened that he was introduced to Dr. Trebitsch in Ephrussy's house. In the first quarter hour of their acquaintance, Dr. Trebitsch spoke tirelessly, and his long blond beard, downflowing in soft darkening strands which grew lighter at the ends, moved regularly up and down before Theodor's eyes and blunted the hearer's concentration. The blond-bearded man's words splashed lightly. One and another clung a while to Theodore and floated away. Never yet had he been so close to a full beard. Suddenly the sound of a name flushed him out of his numbed absent-mindedness. It was Prince Heinrich's name, and with the instinct of a man who stumbles by chance upon a showpiece from his submerged past and drags it to his breast with a hasty saving gesture, Theodore cried, "I was a lieutenant in His Highness Prince Heinrich's regiment." "The prince will be very pleased," said Dr. Trebitsch, and his voice was no longer distant, but quite close. Pride filled Theodore's rib-cage like something physical, and his starched shirt swelled out. They drove in the car to the officers' club, and Theodore sat in the auto, not like the week before when he drove with Mrs. Efrusi. Now he did not feel pressed and thin, the corner between the sidewall and the back cushion. He stretched out. Through greatcoat, jacket, vest, his body felt the easy, cool pliability of the leather. He pushed his feet against the front seat. The cigars filled the coupé with the full aroma of a superfluous coziness. Theodore opened the window and felt the rapid, rushing, cold March wind with the sensuality of an inner flush of warmth. They drank schnapps and beer, and the evening at the officers' club brought to mind a Kaiser's birthday celebration. Count Straupwitz of the Cuirassiers gave a speech. They broke into a triple hurrah. Someone told war anecdotes. Theodore was a guest at the prince's side. He did not let His Highness out of his sight for a moment. He ignored his neighbor on the other side. It was indispensable to be prepared at all times for a question from the prince and to be on his toes. Not for the space of an instant did Theodore forget that now he might finally grasp the opportunity to partly realize his dream. Was he still the unknown little tutor of a Jewish boy? Didn't he know the prince? Didn't he know all the gentlemen he saw here around the table? And although the uncustomary alcohol gradually dulled Theodore's sense of instantaneous little realities, yet an underlying big bright contentment remained, and self-confidence returned to him as often as he needed it, to offer the prince a napkin, a glass, a light for his cigarette. When the prince invited him to tell about that battle at Stoyanovich, which the regiment had brought off so commendably, Theodore began at random, somewhat louder than he usually spoke. For a while it went quite well, until he realized that he had started it without having worked out the conclusion. He paused, and the great listening silence shook him. He recalled that his last words had been Captain von der Heid. "This captain, then," Theodore went on, but failed to find the end of the sentence. "Long may he live! Hurrah!" Dr. Trebitsch jumped in, and they celebrated Captain von der Heid. Then it turned out that Theodore and the prince were taking the same route home, and they sat together in the car. Theodore chattered along the way. He was reminded of Mrs. Efrusi, and he told the prince about her. He could see her large green eyes, her shoulders. He undressed her. She was standing before him in her underwear. She was wearing violet panties. He told it all to the prince, what he saw, did, experienced. "I take off her blouse," said Theodore. "I must inform your highness that she has brown nipples. I bite into her hard breast." "You're a splendid young man," said the prince. He repeated this sentence somewhat later as they were sitting in the living-room drinking black coffee and yet another liqueur. They were sitting so near each other, their thighs touched, and the prince took Theodore's hand and squeezed it. And before he knew it, Theodore was naked, and Prince Heinrich as well. The prince has a hirsute chest and very thin legs. His toes are a bit bent. Theodore has his head lowered, and although it's awkward for him, he must look at those toes. He thinks it would certainly be far better to look the prince in the face. His face, he thinks, is the only part of the prince's body that's dressed. From a rubber balloon the prince squeezes out a cool, fine rain of dust into the air. For the first time, Theodore sees his entire nakedness in a big wall mirror. He can determine that he has white skin tending toward pink, plumply molded legs, a slightly bulging chest, and shining nipples like two tiny dark red cupolas. Theodore is lying on the warm, soft polar bear skin, and near him Prince Heinrich is breathing heavily and loudly. The prince bites into Theodore's flesh. The ends of the prince's beard are scratchy. His frizzy chest and leg hair tickle Theodore. He woke up in a half-dark room, and his first glance met a large oil portrait of the prince on the wall. In startled alertness he saw all the events of the previous night. He struggled against them in vain. He attempted to extinguish them. Anyway, they had never happened. He started thinking about all sorts of unrelated things. He conjugated a Greek verb, but his recent experiences assaulted him, a swarm of intruding flies. He slowly descended the stairs and received the greeting of an old venerable servant. At the same time, the high-pitched ringing of a streetcar announced the proximity of the world. Oh, the proximity of that rich world whose million treasures clanged and shimmered. He foretasted the street, the gait of women, music in their swaying hips, the proud self-confidence of sure-striding men, and his own little wretchedness in their midst. More insignificant than ever before, he left the house. It had always been the case that he must shrink back, hurt, when he had imagined himself exalted, desolate and following ways that led downward whenever he had striven for the heights. He didn't want to shrink back. He wanted to stay here, and he stayed standing before the old venerable servant and inquired of the prince. Prince Heinrich's feet were set in the full basin below the table while he ate his breakfast. "Morning, Teo," said the prince, and left Theodor standing. Theodor stepped close to the table and looked at the prince. The prince broke one egg after another and shook the yolks into a glass. "Sit down," he said finally, and as if he had only now remembered, "You eaten already?" And he shoved eggs, butter, and bread toward Theodor. The food restored Theodor. He ate silently. A good, clear, agreeable calm came over him, and suddenly, as if his tongue had been released from all subjection, his nimble question darted out onto the table, whether the prince needed a secretary. The prince nodded. He had been expecting the question for some time. He writes something on his calling card. "Trebitsch," says the prince, nothing more. And as Theodor stands up, "Good morning," and Theodor leaves the house and goes through the March-chilly Tiergarten and sucks in the blues of the heavens and the first warblings of the birds, and he knows that he is walking uphill, though the street is flat. And he knows that one has to pass through chasms, and that one should forget. He exerts himself to put off the hampering memory of the previous night's events. It's swallowed up by the radiant blues of the morning.